My name is Marieke van Vugt, and as I said, I'm an associate professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I'm also a board member of Mind and Life Europe, and in my work, I'm mostly in the cognitive science business, and I therefore work on sort of trying to, among other things, create computational models of the mind, and specifically mind wandering. But I also do empirical studies as well as measure brain waves to understand what the brain looks like when we mind wander. So that will be the perspective from which I will present. So I would like to see my slides, please. Thank you. So today I will think about, I would like to think together with you about, we often think about mind wandering as the enemy of education, when people are distracted and think about other things. But actually, maybe do we need more mind wandering to allow for more creativity? Yes. Thank you. So let's go back to the beginning. We can go through this a bit quickly because Bob already introduced it. So in the early field of AI, AI was used to create cognitive tutors that help to personalize learning, right? Because, a teacher can only deal with so many students at a time. And then an artificial system that, for example, models memory could be programmed such that it offers you the word you want to learn. Like if you're trying to learn Tibetan, it might might show you the Tibetan word just before you're about to forget it. So this results in a very efficient way of learning. And similarly, some of my colleagues have been working on systems that use a bit more advanced machine learning to estimate, like at what level should we offer equations or math problems to people so that they don't get stuck, but instead they can learn in a more enjoyable way and they can learn also maybe more efficiently. So this sounds great. In recent time, of course, there's been these large language models which have been used in much of the same way by some students to learn stuff, right? As their own private tutor. You just ask it questions at their level and then it responds. However, this also has some issues because as we heard in the last few days, these things have hallucinations. I mean, they're just systems and they just look for statistical patterns, as Emily Bender also explained very clearly yesterday. So it's not a foolproof tutor. And in fact, that's also what's been found in this research that I cite here. On the other hand, you might think, well, maybe large language models can help us to reduce language barriers because they can also do translation pretty well. And we're lucky to have pretty good education facilities in the West, but, in the global South, maybe things are not as available, knowledge is not as available. So then the large language models could maybe make these more available. However, also this has problems because we also know that these systems have massive biases, especially like they're more biased towards the Western culture, with reinforce a lot of societal biases with, professors, that's the stereotypical example. The professor in these systems is always a white male, so this is obviously also a problem in education that you then propagate these kind of biases. So these are some potential benefits, but also some problems. Today, however, I want to highlight another maybe, I think, bigger problem, which is that if you create an education that is very much targeted towards the individual, then you might make it in a way too personalized, right? So there is this problem of the filter bubble that these systems, I mean, whether they embedded in social media, or even like more just general chatbots, they learn what you kind of like, what you want to hear. We also heard about how they tend to be very flattering. That's how they're programmed. So you get locked up in like your filter bubble, as we see in this picture, and your view of the world can be very different from everyone else. Like I always like to joke, but it's kind of true. Like my Instagram feed is all very peaceful. It's all about ballet and Buddhism. But then other people's Instagram feed might be depending on what they like. It might be very distressing news, or it might be, completely different. And how do we then reach each other? How do we understand each other? And I think a large function of education is to get exposed maybe to new ideas, different ideas. That's what teachers do. And it's not always fun, but that's why we need a teacher that is inspiring. If we have a system that's always there, always provides exactly the right information, we don't have this space to be confused, look out of the window, let our minds just wander, right? And there's even evidence for this, that the moment you show a video, people have less mind wandering. They just, don't think. And what makes it even worse is that especially open-ended thinking, where you're not quite sure where you're going, where you're looking at an equation, you're not quite sure how to solve it, this is very hard. And so we don't really want to do it unless we are in a situation that we're forced to. For example, there's a teacher and they expect us to do these things. So there is some sense of that this is necessary and important. But these systems may not give us the chance because we will obviously always do the easier thing. So I think we need more space to mind wander rather than always being fed targeted information that's easy to process. There is yet other issues, or there's a reason why mind wandering is important, which is we mind wander really about 40 to 50% of the time. And actually, what's interesting is that most of these systems that we're interacting with, most of these computational systems, the symbolic AI that I mentioned that I've been working on, they assume that mind wandering is just noise. But actually, we know from empirical research that mind wandering is important for planning, for creativity, and actually, I have therefore started to create computational models. You could say symbolic computational simulations of mind wandering. So we include the mind wandering in the cognitive process to better understand how mind wandering actually affects cognition. So here I assume that we have a model that does memory or attention or something, but then we have a competing process that is this mind wandering. It is maybe these other things like a scientist called David Meyer used to call it the task of life, right? That is always present whenever we are in the classroom. We're never just memorizing or doing this, trying to pay attention to writing an essay. There's also the task of life that is competing. And how does this competition work? And even like these loose thoughts, they are important because, as Kate also mentioned, I think the day before yesterday, they help us to maybe think about other stuff so that in the future we get new ideas, we can recombine existing ideas and so on. We've not yet incorporated that sort of creativity dimension. It's pretty hard to make it into a computational model, but we have already shown that it is kind of adding this mind-wandering dimension is necessary to explain how depression sort of disrupts cognition. So the other way around, because this is also a real phenomena. Anyway, so this is all important because I think this mind-wandering dimension, the insight and the creativity, I don't think it will soon be taken over by artificial systems. We can debate about that in the questions and answers. Anyway, and the other last 2 points that I want to make is that if we just focus on education on the level of information transfer, like these cognitive tutors, these kind of systems, also large language models assume, we forget the embodied dimensions of knowing. Now, I happen to be also a ballet dancer in my free time, just an amateur dancer, but, there I really learned how the body informs our thinking. There is, we have this sense of a gut feeling that, we should go this direction, maybe not that. I also find that through dancing, I sometimes create new ideas through the movement that are not yet verbal, but they are in my body somehow. And yeah, these embodied dimensions are not there in these kind of large language models or other artificial systems. So I think we should bring more attention to the body in education. And I'm in fact involved in an initiative called Embodied Critical Thinking together with Donata Schöller, Siga Torgersdotter, and and this paper also involves another researcher, but he's not mostly involved in this research. But, we teach the students to actually pay more attention to the signals in their body and use it to shape their thinking. So I think this is a really important thing we should not forget in this time of more AI in education. Maybe we should pay more attention to it. And then also there's the social dimension of learning, about which we've already heard a little bit, right? So I just was lucky to spend a lot of time in Tibetan monasteries together with Ani Tenzin Choyang, for example, and Geshe Tafge and Geshe Zangpo, who we heard yesterday. And they are doing this kind of stuff that you see in the picture here. They debate each other. It's a very social process. So the personalized learning systems and even the large language models, they make the learning very individual, right? It's the system that talks to the one person. But the presence of other people in learning helps to motivate us, something that Bob also indicated. But also they challenge our ideas, because one important dimension of education is that, we have to learn where we're right and where we're wrong and test our ideas with the other. And that is what debate is very much about. So I've also been working on a basic chatbot that implements these the monastic debate rules. It's a very symbolic system. So it's not based on large language models. It's very limited in its capacity so far, but I think it's really cool because it helps us to find contradictions in our ideas. And this is something, normally it's not that much fun, but it's very important. So what I wanted to say was AI has always been involved in the, cognitive tutoring, creating more personalized education, but we shouldn't get stuck in the filter bubble. We really need more mind wandering and also more focus on the social and embodied dimensions of education. So thank you very much.